Everyone, so welcome back for what I'm hoping will be a relatively short talk. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about spiritual feedback or spiritual advice versus egoic advice or egoic feedback. Before I do that, I do want to thank all of my patrons on Patreon who contribute monthly to allow me to do this as part of my job. I also want to thank everyone on YouTube who likes, subscribes, and comments. Those really do help me out as well. Okay, so today we're looking at egoic feedback and advice versus spiritual feedback and advice. So when an ego is giving you feedback or advice, they're giving it from a very different perspective from which a spiritual teacher, a true spiritual teacher, is giving you advice or feedback. So this is important to understand because when an ego gives you advice, feedback, whatever, stop doing this, stop doing that, you should try this, you should try that. I'm not going to say always because nothing is always the case, but usually that advice is coming from a perspective of that ego's feelings. So maybe you do something and it makes that person uncomfortable. So they give you feedback. Hey, you really shouldn't raise your voice. Hey, you shouldn't do this or that. And basically what they're doing is giving you their perspective on what makes them uncomfortable, what they like, right? So do you see how when you do XYZ, it gets me upset, it makes me angry, it makes me feel small, it makes me feel unworthy, it makes me feel unloved, whatever it is. Now, I'm not saying that isn't necessarily important information to have or to get, but I hope you can see how that type of feedback or advice is really based on that individual ego's perspective. So another ego, another person will have a different perspective, right? Oh no, I like that you're loud. I like that you make jokes all the time. I like that you, whatever you are, right? So one person likes a certain trait that you have, another person doesn't. And this is important to understand because we as human beings have traits. We just do, for better or worse. Nobody is universally liked or loved. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter who it is. Just no one is universally liked or loved. So some people like gregarious people, loud people, people who live large. Other people want someone who's timid and quiet and understated and subtle. Okay, so what in one person's mind is a positive trait, in another person's mind is a negative trait. So, again, advice like you should be more quiet, you should be more considerate, you should be more whatever it is. Usually this is just ego advice. And again, this is a person telling you what they would like you to do to make them feel more comfortable. Spiritual advice comes from a very different place. Spiritual advice is basically a spiritual teacher sees how you are creating your own suffering. And so if they're giving you advice or feedback, that is to help you stop your own suffering. Okay? So the intention behind the advice is completely different. It's coming from a completely different place, right? Ego giving you advice because it wants to feel different or better. So, hey, you should stop doing that because you make me uncomfortable when you do that. I don't like it when you do that, right? That's ego advice or feedback, right? You should listen to me because, I deserve to be listened to, or whatever it is, right? Ego feedback, ego advice. And then things coming from a spiritual teacher, if it's a real spiritual teacher, if it's real spiritual feedback or advice, is you should do X, Y, and Z, because I think that is going to make you ultimately happier. Ultimately. Now, you may not like the spiritual advice. Now, this is the thing, right? You may not like what you're hearing from either source, honestly. Doesn't matter if it's coming from the ego, doesn't matter if it's coming from a spiritual teacher. But the spiritual advice has a very different intention and a very different target. Again, the spiritual teacher isn't telling you what they want you to do to make them happy, or what they think is right or wrong even, ultimately. I think if it's really spiritual advice, okay, a lot of times spirituality and ethics and morality and social programming get mixed up. Traditionally, that happens a lot. I'm not that interested in that. So let's say it's real spiritual advice. Well, then it's going to focus on what you should do to stop your own suffering, right? To minimize, diminish, and potentially completely eliminate your own suffering. So if it's a real spiritual teacher and they say you should go home and do 30 minutes of pranayama a day, then they're not telling you that because it's going to make them feel better, the teacher feel better. They're telling you that so that you will feel better. If a spiritual teacher tells you should start meditating, if a spiritual teacher tells you should maybe change your diet or whatever it is. Now again, there are a lot of people who I think will set themselves up as a spiritual teacher that are not necessarily spiritual teachers, not in the way that I'm talking about it. Okay, and I'm not trying to put anybody down. I'm just trying to give some perspective here about what I'm talking about. So keep that in mind. Just because someone puts up a shingle that says spiritual teacher, yoga teacher, whatever it is, I'm not saying that person necessarily isn't giving you ego advice. Again, if a teacher is telling you stuff that, it's to make them feel comfortable, it's to serve them, then that's just more ego advice. It doesn't matter if it's coming out of a spiritual teacher's mouth. Same with me. If I give you advice like that, ego advice, hey, that makes me really uncomfortable when you do this or that or whatever it is, that's just ego feedback and advice. Now, some egos really think that you should listen to that advice that they give. And they actually think the whole world should be structured in that way. That basically they should be able to go around and tell people what makes them uncomfortable and have those people stop doing those things. This is a real problem. And this is actually a problem that we see in society now. I'm not going to get into it in this talk, but this is happening more and more, where people are losing their sense of resiliency. And it's getting easier and easier to offend certain groups and certain groups of people. They just basically, their skin is getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And it's getting easier and easier to offend them and to upset them and to, get them into a state of outrage. So my spiritual advice to you, if you self-identify like that, I hope you don't. I hope that you have spiritual, you have resiliency, emotional resiliency. For me, if spirituality is really working in your life, then you're going to get less and less offended by things, not more and more offended. You're going to become more and more sensitive, but you're also going to become more and more resilient at the same time. That's true spiritual growth. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. Not just one or the other. If we have just one or the other, then there really isn't a balance there. So more sensitive and at the same time more resilient. Now, more sensitive doesn't mean that you necessarily tiptoe around everyone's feelings all the time, okay? So don't misunderstand me. There is a lot to be said for authenticity and for not being afraid to really be yourself and to be free. And people often don't appreciate that and they don't want that. They don't like that. It can make them very uncomfortable. So again, ego advice can come from those corners where it's like, hey, stop being like that. That makes me uncomfortable. That makes me upset. When you're strong, when you're powerful, when you have your voice, it makes me uncomfortable. So this is an important distinction, and I hope you'll keep it in mind. And again, when a spiritual teacher, a true spiritual teacher, is giving you feedback, giving you advice, telling you, hey, you should try this, you should do that, again, it is for your benefit. Even if you don't like what they're saying, and that's why I'm really trying to drive this point home, is we might not like what we're hearing, we might not like what was said, we might not agree with it, okay? And I'm not saying spiritual teachers are always right about everything either, but it's the intention, where the advice is coming from. A true spiritual teacher is coming from a very different perspective. They are, again, trying to help point out things where you are basically hurting yourself, and spiritually speaking. And spiritually speaking usually means in every way. So again, whatever it might be, whatever the advice might be, the intention is to help you and aid you. An ego giving you advice, giving you feedback, hey, I think you should do this, I think you should stop that. Again, not always, but very often self-serving and based on their own perspective. It's not saying that a good friend of yours can't, give you advice, that they think is going to benefit you. I'm not saying that. I'm kind of talking about, again, kind of like the kind of personal feedback you get like in relationship with people. Oftentimes parents will give this kind of advice or feedback to children without realizing it. And the parents are trying to form the children into what they think society is going to like, what is acceptable in society, what is approved of. And again, most parents do this and they're not evil. They're not trying to do harm to their children. In fact, they're trying to help their children. But doing the work that I do now, that is dealing a lot with emotions and repression and trauma and stuff, it's amazing to see how much damage is done very often in childhood as parents try to help their children in this way. Again, they're basically giving them advice and feedback that is causing them to be inauthentic, ultimately, to not really be themselves, and how important the things the parents are pointing out or insisting about, how important they actually are in reality, is really, really debatable. So it's really difficult to say that the parents are, doing a good job of, teaching their children right from wrong. I know that's what most parents think. But again, from the place where I sit, it's hard to say, when you've seen what I've seen, whether or not more harm is being done than good, honestly, to be really, really honest with you. And if you're a parent, I'm not trying to criticize you. I think we just haven't really taken a hard look at human culture, human society, and human development yet, and really figured out the kind of magic formula. So I really truly believe everyone's doing the best they can. I know my parents were, just from being present with them. They definitely didn't do a perfect job. I'm not sure that anyone's parents can or have ever. I don't even know if it's possible. But they did a perfect job in the sense that I'm here, I'm healthy, and I'm happy. So what more can you ask of your parents than that? So anyway, I hope you'll keep this in mind. This is an important principle because, again, as I share with you, I may share ideas and things that you don't want to hear, that you don't like to hear. But please keep in mind the perspective from which it comes from. It doesn't come from a self-serving perspective. It doesn't come from a perspective of, my belief system or my opinion. And it's not to say, again, that I can't be wrong about certain concepts or certain ideas, certain things. But generally, the feedback, the advice, the perspective I'm sharing is one where I see the ways in which people actually cause their own suffering, create their own misery. And so the advice, the feedback is given from that perspective. It's a little bit like if you saw someone who was hitting their head against the wall and complaining about having a headache, and you said, hey, you know what? Why don't you try not hitting your head against the wall? Maybe that headache will go away. And they stop and the headache does go away. It may be hard to believe, but this is a lot what the life of an awakened teacher is like. You kind of see how people create their own suffering. And it's sort of like, hey, maybe you should stop that. Maybe you should try something else. Because from my perspective, we create our own suffering, full stop. And when you really grasp that concept and take it to heart, it's life-changing because it's empowering. And keep that in mind. As long as you give others the power to take your peace, joy, and happiness, then you are ultimately powerless because they can come and take it from you at any time. The minute you say, no, that's not the way it is. I'm responsible for my peace, joy, and happiness. No one else. Then you get your power back. And this is very important as far as I'm concerned. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks again to all of you who helped support me in the teaching. And until next time, namaste and have a great day.